and I got to travel to Washington, D.C. with him, and I'll tell you some great stories about that in another podcast when we talk about lobbying. But he was instrumental in giving me my first class to teach, because I told him one time that I was interested in teaching a class. And he gave me my very first class to teach at Cal State Long Beach. It was an elective on law and social work. And I was working at the time at an agency that provided free legal services to children and families in Los Angeles. And thereafter, Dr. Kelly asked me to teach more classes at California State University, Long Beach. So he was really supporting my desire and intent to teach. And when I decided to go back to school to get my PhD, Dr. Kelly wrote me a letter of recommendation, and I was able to get into the University of Southern California as a PhD student. And a few years later, as I was working on my dissertation, Dr. Kelly called me, and by then he had moved to become the Dean of the College of Health and Human Services at California State University, Los Angeles. So Dr. Kelly called me on the phone. He said, "Hey, Victor, would you like to come to the School of Social Work here at California State University, Los Angeles, and teach as a field faculty while you're finishing your dissertation?" I said, "Sure, I would love to," because I hadn't had a full-time job in a few years since I'd been in the PhD program. So it was great to have a job while I was finishing my dissertation. So as I finished my dissertation in 2001, the School of Social Work at Cal State LA had opened a position for an assistant professor, a tenure-track position there in the School of Social Work. And since I had already worked there as a field faculty member, the faculty knew me well, and I think that went a long way to helping me get hired there as an assistant professor in 2002, is when I started teaching as a tenure-track faculty. I ended up getting tenure and a promotion to associate professor, and here I am today. I'm still teaching at Cal State LA, and have had just wonderful, wonderful career and journey since then to bring me to this day today. So if it weren't for my mentor, Jim Kelly, and I owe him everything, and I will follow him wherever he goes. And that's what, so I guess the moral of the story is, get your MSW, join NASW, and become a professor at a university. Okay, so do all those things, and I pray that you will have the same success that I have had in my career. So that's part of what relationships can do for you. But of course, we want to use our relationships beyond our ability to serve our clients and to serve ourselves in our careers. So the second thing that we can do with our relationships, and the importance of these relationships, is that these relationships help you to understand more about your community or your community of interest, right? So let's talk about your community. For example, your neighborhood. If you don't develop relationships with your neighbors or the people that live in your neighborhood, you won't know what's going on in your neighborhood. If you don't establish relationships with people in your broader community, you won't know what's going on in your community. You won't understand what is going on in your community. If you don't create relationships with people where you work, in your agency and in your institutions, and I'm not just talking about your coworkers, but I'm talking about the people that are your supervisors, people that are managers, people that are administrators, all the way up to the top. Executive directors, CEOs, or other people in your organization, even the people that are in different departments in your agency and organization, even people that are perhaps lower on the organization rung than you are. If you don't create those types of relationships, you won't understand how your agency or organization works. You'll only understand it from your point of view, your vantage point, as in whatever position you're in. And it's the same thing with social work. When I joined NASW and I started to get actively involved, I really, even though I knew in my brain that there was a diversity of social workers and social work practice areas, I didn't know it, the breadth of it, until I actually got to meet people and find out the different areas and arenas in which social workers practice. So our relationships help us to understand those communities and communities of interest. So for example, if your expertise is in child abuse, you need to get to know people that work in that arena. If you're interested in the unhoused or people who are homeless, you need to get to know people and professionals and volunteers and clients and people that are in that area of interest, so that you can understand that community of interest. These are important relationships to have. That could be nonprofits, it could be faith-based organizations that you're part of, it could be cultural groups and associations, it could be service clubs, it could be parent-teacher associations in your kids' elementary or high schools. It could be getting to know the people in your neighborhood, as I mentioned earlier. Like, for example, in my own city here in Artesia, we are so diverse in this city. There are people here from Portugal. There are people here from Holland. There are Mexicans, Filipinos, Koreans, Chinese. There's so many churches in my city, diverse restaurants, from South Asian Indian restaurants and Filipino restaurants and Ethiopian restaurants. There are people that live in my city from Nepal. I mean, it's truly amazing, but I wouldn't know this unless I was actually out and active in my community. So the thing about getting to know your community or your community of interest is this. Uncle Saul, and I'll refer to him from now on as Uncle Saul, because I like to do that for some reason, because I think he has some wise words to say. Saul Alinsky. I quoted him at the end of my last podcast, and he, of course, is the great community organizer and wrote Rules for Radicals and other books about community organizing. But Uncle Saul said, the basic requirement for the understanding of the politics of change is to recognize the world as it is. We must work with it on its terms if we are able to change it to the kind of world we would like it to be. So I relate this quote to what we just talked about in terms of getting to know your communities, your agencies, your organizations. If you don't understand how these institutions, our communities, our neighborhoods, if we don't understand the way that they are, the way that they work, we cannot change it to how we want it to be. So we need to start there. The third thing that you can do with your relationships is to be able to, as you grow and build your and extend your network through these relationships, they can help you to convene people together for collective action, because that's the underlying power of what Uncle Saul talked about in community organizing, and that is collective action in order to change neighborhoods, communities, agencies, governments to be the kinds of institutions that we would like them to be. So I'm going to tell you a very quick story because we're running out of time, but I want to tell you a very quick story about how I've used my extensive social work professional network to create a couple of programs here locally to serve former foster youth and transitional aged youth here in Los Angeles County. I met a young man named Christian who is a social worker and a former foster youth. He was made known to me by my good friend and colleague Amanis Sanati, who is the regional director of one of our regions here in the California chapter of NASW. And she said, "This young man, Christian, is looking for a mentor. Would you like to be his mentor?" I said, "Sure." So Christian and I met, and we've been meeting once a month, probably for the past, probably been 2, maybe 3 years now. And during the course of our relationship, Christian told me about his background, and we got around to the subject of the fact that what he had been working on, and that is to build a pipeline for former foster youth. And he said to me, that there are a lot of former foster youth that want to be social workers, and that he would like to support that in some way. And he thought that workforce development boards might be the way to do it. Well, as an elected official, I had sat on the policy board of one of our local workforce development boards. So I went to the workforce development board and I pitched them the idea. Hey, how about we recruit former foster youth who want to be social workers? We put them through a job training, which the workforce development already does, because their objective is to find jobs for people. So they already do job training for people. I said, let's do job training, but also, since they're interested in social work, I can bring social workers in to speak with them and to talk to them about their experience as social workers. And then, with NASW, we could help find agencies where these participants, after they go through their job training, could actually be placed in a work site where they could get paid hours to get social work experience, and hopefully take that experience to enroll into a community college or to enroll into a university to pursue a degree in social work. That all came about because of my relationships with Christian through NASW and with the Workforce Development Board. Now there's a companion project that is also stemmed from this, because Christian is involved with a nonprofit organization called Foster Nation that recruits mentors from former foster youth who are now out in the world and successful. And we want to pair those mentors with current foster youth or transitional aged youth. And because I have a relationship with the Department of Children and Family Services here in Los Angeles County, with the director and with the regional administrator who at the local office that serves my community, we have a meeting coming up where we are going to talk to DCFS about connecting their transitional aged youth with mentors. So that's another great project that we're working on. And that's all comes out of the network that I've developed and being able to connect different parts of my network to serve specific purpose, to, in this case, to support former foster youth and transitional aged youth. So thank you so much for taking the time to be with me and to listen to my podcast, my second episode. And we remind you, I would love to get your feedback on my podcast. So please go to my website and feel free to give me your comments and suggestions for future podcasts. And again, you can find me on LinkedIn, Victor Manalo. You can also find me on Instagram as the Macro Social Worker. Again, my name is Dr. Victor Manalo. I am the Macro Social Work Mentor, and this is my podcast. And I'm going to leave you with another quote from Saul Alinsky. This is the quote for the day for this podcast. Saul Alinsky wrote, "Action is for mass salvation." Action is for mass salvation. So let's get out there, social workers, and prepare